Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for this TCFD Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures session for the banking sector. Today, we're looking at the first part of this training, which looks at governance and strategy, which are, as many might know, many may not, the first two pillars of the TCFD framework. Now, before we get started, I wanted to make sure everybody is aware that we have interpretation on this training session. So at the bottom or top of your screen, depending on your platform, you can choose a little globe that says interpretation, and you can choose either original audio, which will mostly be in English, with the few exceptions, or English or Portuguese, and that will remain in that particular language. I would also like to thank our interpreter, Carlos, for joining us today, and we promise to do our best to speak clearly and slowly so that the interpretation is easy to follow. Now, to get us started, I'd like to pass to our host today. Just one slide, yeah, perfect. To Mr. Carlos Pinto, who is the country manager for the Brazil country for the IFC, to give our opening remarks. Over to you, Mr. Pinto.
Thank you, Tiffany. I will switch to Portuguese now because the audience is Portuguese speaking. I think it's nice if I can make my opening remarks in Portuguese. Portanto, boas-vindas calorosas a todos os participantes que se juntam hoje a nós para o início deste treinamento executivo sobre a Task Force de divulgações relacionadas ao clima, o chamado TCFD. Eu diria que podemos dar um subtítulo: Riscos climáticos às oportunidades, e este treinamento, queria chamar a atenção, foi desenhado especialmente para profissionais do setor financeiro. Como a Tiffany disse, eu sou o gerente-geral da IFC para o Brasil, estou baseado em São Paulo. Para aqueles que estão menos familiarizados, a IFC, International Finance Corporation, é parte integrante do Grupo Banco Mundial e é o maior banco mundial de desenvolvimento que apoia o crescimento do setor privado de uma forma sustentável. Nosso trabalho engloba diversas áreas prioritárias, desde logo a inclusão financeira, a redução do gap de género e o apoio a micro, pequenas e médias empresas. Temos um forte compromisso com a agenda climática e o alcance de todos os objetivos de desenvolvimento sustentável. Posso dizer-vos, como parte desse compromisso, a IFC como um todo tem o objetivo de 35% dos seus investimentos terem um tag, um ângulo climate, e posso-vos dar a boa notícia de que no Brasil, nos nossos investimentos realizados no Brasil, nós estamos bem acima deste target. No ano fiscal que vamos fechar em 2 semanas, vamos atingir já um rácio de 66%. Portanto, bem acima daquilo que foi o objetivo definido pela IFC para este ano em todo o mundo. Estamos a financiar projetos para a mitigação e adaptação às mudanças climáticas, outros projetos ambientais que são realizados por vocês, bancos comerciais e empresas que apoiamos por meio de financiamento, também serviços de consultoria, compartilhamento de conhecimento, como é o caso deste treinamento, e a promoção das melhores práticas. Gostaria de vos dizer que no Brasil praticamos muito o Climate Finance. E isso que é o Climate Finance, essencialmente, são crédito e debentures temáticas. Estamos falando de Green Bonds, Green Loans, Blue Loans, Blue Bonds, Gender Bonds, produtos estruturados. Estamos falando aqui neste caso dos chamados Sustainable Link Bonds, investimento em energias renováveis, nos setores da água, saneamento e dos resíduos sólidos urbanos, em projetos de descarbonização, tanto na área da indústria como na área dos transportes, as construções sustentáveis, os chamados green buildings, a smart agriculture, portanto a agricultura que tem uma perspectiva de sustentabilidade, e de muitos outros. Agora gostaria de fazer-vos alguns comentários sobre o programa de consultoria TCFD e este treinamento em particular. Devo dar-vos nota que este é a segunda turma de treinamento executivo em 2023, depois de um ano de rollout muito importante a nível do mundo inteiro. Para terem alguma ideia, este treinamento já foi realizado em mais de 40 bolsas em todo o mundo, stock exchanges, mais de 55 mercados e mais de 15.000 empresas e bancos. Portanto, tem um impacto muito grande, abrangeu um universo extremamente alargado. A crescente demanda por treinamento sobre o clima é o resultado do avanço imparável da agenda climática e da jornada de transformação dos bancos comerciais em direção a uma banca que se pretende sustentável e responsável. O impacto das mudanças climáticas requer ajustes estruturais significativos na economia global, afetando os negócios e as operações de bancos e outras instituições financeiras. O setor bancário, e para mim isto é muito importante, desempenha um papel crucial em mercados emergentes ao contribuir para a implementação da agenda climática e direcionar os fluxos de finanças climáticas para atingir a neutralidade de carbono e o alinhamento de Paris. As mudanças climáticas representam riscos sistémicos materiais. Não nos podemos esquecer isto. Eu vou repetir. As mudanças climáticas representam riscos sistémicos materiais que podem afetar a estabilidade dos mercados financeiros. E para lidar com esses riscos são necessários dados robustos, abrangentes e de alta qualidade sobre os impactos das mudanças climáticas, de forma a que possamos orientar a alocação do capital e facilitar ações de mitigação e adaptação. Por outro lado, não nos esqueçamos que os investidores agora exigem informações financeiras relacionadas ao clima que sejam úteis para a tomada de decisão de investimento, o que leva os bancos a atualizarem seus conhecimentos sobre riscos relacionados ao clima e estrutura de relatórios. Nesse contexto, esta Task Force de divulgações financeiras relacionadas ao clima, o chamado TCFD, emergiu como uma ferramenta primordial, fornecendo aos bancos e empresas um roteiro para divulgar informações relevantes. Eu acho que esta é a frase que resume o que estamos aqui fazendo neste treinamento. É aprofundar o conhecimento neste roteiro que permite aos bancos e instituições financeiras divulgar informações relevantes em termos climáticos. Por último, cabe dizer que este treinamento resulta do esforço conjunto da IFC, das Nações Unidas através do UN Environment Programme Finance Initiative e o CDP, o Climate Disclosure Project. Agradecendo a todos os que possibilitaram este treinamento e aos meus colegas de Climate Finance em particular, Marcela Ponce e Carlos Serrano, e a todos vocês, participantes que aceitaram o nosso convite em estar nesse treinamento. Queria só recordar-vos que este treinamento confere 2 certificados, um por cada sessão, são individuais, portanto, por cada sessão que participarem terão direito a receber um certificado. Desejo a todos um bom treinamento e muito obrigado. Over to you, Tiffany.
Thank you so very much. And thank you to your team at IFC as well, also the financial institutions group at IFC, Carlos Serrano, who's here, and Ariana. It's been great to be a part of the collaboration within the IFC team, and we look forward to many more in the future. Also, I would like to give a big thank you to our partners who are helping to facilitate this training today. As Carlos has just mentioned, it is a collaborative effort, and together with the UNEP Finance Initiative and CDP. So today you have many facilitators, myself from the SSE, and I'm here with my colleague Vanina, who will be helping in the background answer your questions. Also, we have two colleagues from the UN Environment Finance Initiative, Leah and Jan, who are both experts on climate-related financial disclosures, and specifically from the TCFD for Banks team at UNEP-FI. And finally, but certainly not least, we have Raisa from CDP, who is a policy coordinator and knows well the policy space, as well as how to disclose this information, given the leadership of CDP on this topic. So please don't hesitate to ask us questions throughout. If you, short housekeeping, as some have done, please feel free to introduce yourself. We'd love to know who you are and where you're coming from. Someone has said they can't hear me. If I could get a nod from the panel, if you can hear me, that would be great. Yes, okay, so the person, okay, some people can, great. So if you can't hear me,
Tiffany. Yes.
Great, thanks, Carlos. Maybe play with your audio a bit. Maybe Vanina, you can type to them and help them figure that out. Great, thanks everyone. So please do communicate with us. We're here live to help you through all of these topics. We're here to introduce you to them, but also to deepen your knowledge. So please ask us questions by typing them into the Q&A box. You'll see there's an option for a chat box, and there's an option for a Q&A box. If you type it in the Q&A box, we're more likely to see that question and answer it for you. If you want to ask your question in Portuguese, if you're more comfortable that way, we will do our best also to use Google Translate. So please excuse any not entirely correct translations. We'll do our best. But if you do feel comfortable asking in English, we will then also respond in English. I will move on to the next slide, which is our overview of what we're doing today. And here, just to note, we do have a slight break, just 5 minutes halfway through our session today. And the main topic of today's training is, as I mentioned, the first two pillars of the TCFD's disclosure framework, which is 4 total pillars. But just to remind you, they don't act in silos. So if you're working, for example, on enhancing governance structures to support climate-related risk management, then of course you need to connect governance and risk management, which are 2 pillars. Similarly, you need to make sure you're measuring appropriately your progress, which needs to then connect also to your metrics and targets. And if you want a robust strategy that integrates all of these topics, you then, of course, also need to connect strategy, which is another pillar. So while we're discussing 2 pillars today, please remember that they all are related and interconnected. So we have 4 learning objectives that we hope to achieve with all of you today. The first is really understanding what are those key elements of climate-related financial disclosures according to the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and particularly why it might be relevant to your organization. We also look to help you to identify how climate can be integrated into specifically the governance of your organization and what role that governance plays in your organization's resilience or long-term survival. Also, we look to help you to understand how banks in particular can strategically respond to climate-related risks and opportunities. And that's through the integration into your strategy. And finally, we're going to deep dive into a tool, the scenario analysis, and understanding how that can further enhance your resilience as an organization and as a bank. So as we get started here, I just wanted to get to know a little bit about each of you. So the questions in the poll should be in Portuguese, but what we would like to ask is, how comfortable are you already with the TCFD's 11 recommended disclosures? Would you consider yourself an expert? Are you confident, but you're here to just get a little bit of an update to see what's new? Do you have limited knowledge on this topic? Or do you have little or no prior knowledge on this topic? There's no right or wrong answer. We just want to learn a little bit more about you so we can adapt accordingly. And I'll give you a few seconds to fill that out. Okay. Great. So the majority say that they have limited understanding. So that's great to hear that you've already been introduced to this topic and that maybe now we can create a more deeper understanding of it. For those who have very little or no prior knowledge, not to fear. We're providing you with many resources to get you started. And if anything is unclear, or if you would like more clarification, please just feel free to ask us a question in the Q&A box. I see a couple hands are raised. So if you do have a question already, please type that question to us. You can type it in the Q&A box, which is a little app at the bottom or top of your screen. And with that, we're going to get started on what is TCFD. And before we get started, I want to make it very clear that the objective of TCFD here is really that connection between finance and climate. If after this training you feel like you still need a more deeper understanding of this topic, I do recommend you can check our YouTube channel to listen to recordings of our trainings, or use the TCFD Knowledge Hub, which has a number of additional training programs included. Okay, so why did the TCFD come to be? Well, increasingly, we are seeing evidence of climate-related risks feeding into our global and systemic understanding of risks much more broadly. We'll discuss a lot today about specific climate-related risks, and it's important to recognize, however, that they are interconnected to other risks within our environment and other business risks that we'll be discussing. So on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see that since 2019, the top 3 global risks by likelihood, according to the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report, have all been climate related. So in this table, anything that's green is climate related risks. The blue one at the bottom is the only one that is not climate related. So this most recent report in 2023 found that the top 3 risks by likelihood are failure to mitigate climate change, failure of climate change adaptation, and natural disasters and extreme weather events. And if we were to put those into TCFD terms, which we'll discuss a bit later, the first 2, that failure to mitigate and failure to climate or to adapt, really have to do with our transition risks, the risk of a transitioning world around us. And the third one, physical risks, the physical impacts from natural disasters and extreme weather events. So the TCFD helps us understand how those particular risks will integrate into our organization. Now, on the left-hand side of that slide, you'll see a quote. It is in English on the slide, but I'd like to emphasize that it's from the CEO of BlackRock from a few years back now, but indicating the significant and lasting impact that climate change will have on economic growth and prosperity is not fully being reflected in markets. And that's really where the TCFD is starting from. So here you'll see a face that you may or may not be familiar with. Mark Carney is the UN Special Envoy on Climate Action and Finance. He was also the former chair to the G20 Financial Stability Board and the governor of the Bank of England. And in this speech that he gave at the Lloyd's of London, he indicated that the horizon for monetary policy extends out 2 to 3 years. And for financial stability, it's a bit longer, but typically only to the outer boundaries of the credit cycle, about a decade. In other words, once climate change becomes a defining issue for financial stability, it may already be too late. And the real point here is that this speech, which is now about 8 years old, was indicating that we're not able yet to calculate today the risks that are going to face us from climate change in the future, even though the decisions we make today are what going to determine how resilient we are as a company in the future when those changes in our climate come to fruition. So what are these risks and these opportunities? Now, because I don't want to spend too much time explaining these, I'm going to go through them just briefly. But as Vanina's just popped in the chat box there is a handout which gives much more detail and links to the TCFD's guidance, which gives a really thorough description of each of these risks that you might see. Now, the TCFD does have 2 kind of risk categories, broad risk categories. There's transition risks, which include policy and legal risks, technology risk, market risk, and reputational risks. And then there's physical risks, which include acute and chronic. So just to give you an example from the transition risks, we might see in the policy side shifting regulation that requires companies to disclose information, such as the increasing disclosure requirements on TCFD, where we'll hear about later, more and more governments are requiring companies to disclose information pertaining to their climate risk management. We might also see changes in the market and reputation. Clients, consumers are looking for companies to be more responsible, and they want to know what impact their money is having. And technology is changing. So if technology changes to a point that our business is no longer relevant, how prepared are we for that? Also, physical risks can be both acute and chronic. So when we're talking about chronic physical risks, these are physical risks that are more longer term. They compound over time, and they pertain to shifts in the climate patterns. So we might see sustained high temperatures that may cause things like sea level rises or chronic heat waves over time. We might also see acute risks, which could happen at the same time, but these physical risks are event-driven, such as increased severity of extreme weather events like cyclones, hurricanes, or floods. What's important about the TCFD is then connecting these risks that we see to the financial impact they have on our organization. Now, first, you have to be able to identify those risks to understand how they might influence your organization. And we will be talking later about how to use a scenario analysis to understand that financial impact. But please keep in mind that the recommended disclosures of the TCFD are not aimed at simply helping you identify risks or making you disclose more information about your emissions. What they're really there to do is make that connection between those risks and the opportunities and your financial filings. So we want to understand, will these transition risks impact your revenue, or maybe severe weather events will have an impact on your impairment charges or your losses. Potentially, they can have an impact on your portfolio value. If there's a huge shift in regulation and using fossil fuels becomes much more expensive, how much of your portfolio is going to be impacted by that? How many companies are going to go out of business in your portfolio? It's helping you understand that connection. What's important, though, is to not forget those opportunities. So this is a really interesting report that you can read. It's in your handout, and it's from CDP. I think it's called Thorny Risks, Rosy Opportunities, something about rosy opportunities. And it took an analysis of 500 of the world's biggest companies by market capitalization, where 215 companies representing $16.95 trillion in market capitalization provided estimations of that potential financial impact I was talking about, how climate-related risks and opportunities will financially impact their organization. Now, they found that there was about $970 billion at risk from climate-related risks and opportunities. However, they also found that $2.1 trillion would result from the opportunities that come from climate. So it's important to remember that those opportunities are often actually more material than the risks. So even though we're going to talk a lot about risks today, remember that there's a lot of opportunities here that the TCFD also helps you to identify. And it helps you transition your company to ensure that you foresee these changes in the future and are prepared for them when they arrive. Now, what are those opportunities? Again, more details in your handout, but just to highlight kind of the key opportunities that the TCFD wants all organizations to assess. Those are resource efficiency, energy source opportunities, products and services, markets, and resilience. Now, I think resource efficiency and energy source are quite clear opportunities. Many of you are probably very aware of. Also, products and services are less relevant necessarily for the financial sector, but important for the companies who you are investing in or providing loans to. For markets, I might highlight an important thing that Carlos mentioned in the introductory remarks, and that is new forms of financing. So market opportunities involve proactively seeking opportunities in markets or types of assets that may be available to diversify activities and to better position a company. So this might be new collaborations and working jointly to fund projects. It also can be captured through underwriting or financing green bonds and interest structures, for example, in a low emission energy products, energy efficiency, grid connectivity, or transport or networks. So the banking sector can have a really important role in accessing those opportunities related to markets. Now, as a reminder, those all have to connect to our financial impacts. So the TCFD is not just there to help you identify these, they identify them for you. What you have to do as a company is identify how those impact financially your organization. And for a bank, that's really understanding as well in your portfolio how these risks and opportunities are going to impact your the companies that you're providing financing for. So with that, let's do a quick quiz just to make sure that everybody is following. So again, the question should be in Portuguese on your screen. But the question is, what are the examples of financial impacts from climate a bank might want to disclose or report? The options are revenue growth from increased sustainable financing, impact on talent acquisition due to the perception that your bank is not accurately addressing climate-related issues, fines and judgments from new climate-related regulation, increased competitive positioning as a result of changes in consumer preference, and or all of the above. And I'll give you just a few moments to fill that in. Okay, maybe 10 more seconds to fill that out. Okay. Well done, everyone. So actually, you're all correct. The answer was really all, but if you picked any of them, you're indeed correct. So revenue growth is, of course, an opportunity from increased sustainable finance, which could be from, for example, accessing new markets like green bonds. The second is an impact on talent acquisition, which, of course, could lead to, if you're not addressing climate change, it might lead to a reputational risk, which is one of the transition risk categories. And of course, that can impact talent acquisition, especially with the younger generations. The third one is fines and judgments from new climate-related regulation. And indeed, this also hits your balance sheet since you have to pay those fines or for the litigation, which then can also have an impact on your reputational risk. So that might be a policy risk or reputational risk, which are both transition risks. Finally, we have consumer preferences, which again can lead to opportunities through the markets. And this can also lead to resilience, which we'll be talking about a lot today. Great. So I hope that this is correct. Okay. So I see many of you were asking about the handout. You can receive the handout. Oh, and it looks like, sorry, one of the answers was missing in the Portuguese version, but you would have been right if you would have chosen that one. And the handout is available in the chat. So you can, it's all the same one being shared many times so that you can access it. I'm going to actually skip this slide because it's very self-explanatory and you can read it on your own time, but important to note that there are many benefits of using TCFD aligned disclosure. But let's discuss exactly what are the TCFD's recommended disclosures. Now we'll go into each one in more detail today and tomorrow, but to note a few key aspects of the TCFD's recommended disclosures. Now, these recommendations were developed to help identify the information needed by investors, lenders such as yourselves, insurance underwriters, in order to appropriately assess the financial impacts of climate-related risks and opportunities. Now, what we see in the 11 recommended disclosures is they fit within kind of 4 broad categories: governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. We'll be discussing today the governance and strategy component, and then tomorrow risk management and metrics and targets. But as I mentioned, they're all really interconnected, and you need to see them as one holistic package. So because, as I was discussing, what we're trying to do here is understand those climate-related risks and opportunities and how they financially impact our organization, we want to see this information disclosed together with our financial information. In the same way that you provide, together with your financial disclosures, explanatory notes and an additional report to try to discuss why maybe your profits are up or down, what you're expecting in the future, this is where we want to see climate-related financial information. So materially relevant information that impacts our company financially. That means that we don't need to do an extra report, which is good. And what we want to include in that information is both those physical and transition risks and the opportunities that we've just discussed. We also are looking further time horizon, further in the future than normal, than we're used to. A lot of times in our financial reporting, we're looking mostly backwards. We want to look further in the future. So we should be using a short, a medium, and a long-term time horizon. And we also use both qualitative and quantitative disclosures here. So the key point really is where this information should appear. The good news is the TCFD is not recommending you create an extra TCFD report. Rather, what we want to understand is how it's connected to our financial filings. So how it impacts our financial position as a company and our financial proposition. So what is our balance sheet? So it should appear with that information. The biggest misconception, I think, about the TCFD is that it's an additional report that companies have to provide information in, but rather it should appear either in your annual reporting package with your financial filings, if it's financially material, or in a sustainability report, such as your GRI report, if it's not deemed to be financially material. You can create an additional climate report, however, if you feel the need to really highlight that information to your stakeholders. You also will have supplemental guidance for your particular sector. So we have those 4 pillars at the bottom there. And then we have the 11 recommended disclosures. And then on top of that, in addition to disclosing those 11 recommended disclosures, you'll have additional disclosures for certain sectors, and the banking sector is one of them. So just to show you what that might look like, here is one example of a supplementary or an additional disclosure for the banking sector. So if you look under strategy, that dark blue pillar, that box under A for banks indicates that banks should provide additional information under strategy category A, which is, we'll discuss later, but that's understanding what are, and disclosing what are the financially material risks and opportunities facing your organization. So in addition to identifying those financially material risks and opportunities, a bank should also be considering characterizing their climate-related risks in the context of traditional banking industry categories, such as credit risk, market risk, liquidity risk, and operational risk. Now, I'm going to skip by these couple slides because they're, again, quite self-explanatory. But just to note that the banking sector is improving significantly in recent years. And you can view that progress in the TCFD status report. The latest one is from 2022. And I also highly recommend reading this report by Bain and Company, which really illustrates how if you do move soon, those that are leaders will have a significantly higher profit growth than those that take too long to address these issues. So being a first mover on these topics definitely pays off. And if you're struggling to convince anyone in your organization, this is a great report to show the impact in your profit for pioneering or moving quickly on these topics. That said, this is from 2021. Also, the TCFD came out in 2017. So already it's a little bit, time to move. We need to get moving. And I'll also leave this with you because my time is nearly up here on creating a roadmap. Now, every roadmap is going to be different. This is an illustrative one, but the first step is, I'd say, creating that internal working group, creating a TCFD team, having that internal team within your organization that's going to make sure you're moving in the right direction, and then conducting a gap analysis. And you can use the SSE model guidance on climate disclosures. In Annex 1, you'll find a tool and a checklist that you can use as a gap analysis, and that could get you started if you're just at the beginning phases. And you can also use this in your slides as you move forward to identify those steps that you might need to go through. Okay, I'll skip this question because again, we are short on time. And I'm going to pass over to my colleague, Raisa, who's going to take you through the climate reporting landscape. Over to you, Raisa.
Thank you, Tiffany. I hope you can all hear me well. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm Raisa Sare. I'm Policy Coordinator at CDP Latin America. I'm currently based in São Paulo. First of all, I'd like to thank the invitation to participate in this training. I hope I can contribute to this, to the knowledge that has been built so far. I'm going to discuss a little bit of the climate reporting landscape, building on what Tiffany has already brought in her part. I can pass the slide. Okay, now it's working. So in this first slide, I'm just going to discuss a little bit of the regulatory movement so far. We already established that climate change definitely is an important issue for financial organizations to consider. But we are also seeing right now actually big changes in policy regulations in general and standards. Like even though TCFD is still remains voluntary market-led initiatives, we are seeing many governments, many regulators that are taking steps to either require or encourage disclosures based on TCFD recommendations. Now we are already seeing over 120 regulators and governments all around the world who are TCFD reporters. And we're talking from countries like Belgium, Japan, New Zealand, and the UK. We are also seeing regulatory authorities going beyond just the discussion and just the speech to support TCFD. Many countries such as the UK, the US, Japan, New Zealand have already taken steps to mandating climate disclosures or proposing climate disclosure in line with the TCFD. Here in this slide, we can clearly see that there's a real regulatory and policy movement thinking about TCFD. Speaking specifically of Brazil, we can see that in 2021, Central Bank issued a TCFD-aligned disclosure for regulated institutions. This image, of course, it's a bit old, it's outdated, but you can see in the new TCFD report that was launched in 2022, how this has been evolving. This is a constant change, and this is also what is interesting in this regulatory movements that we have been seeing. And now I'm gonna talk a little bit for the banking sector, how this has been developed. So I'm zooming in a little bit more on the movements for banking sector. And as Stephen mentioned, one of the supplemental guidance is for the banking sector. So we should consider what the TCFD guidance for banks brings as relevant. First of all, a bank should look to provide metrics to assess the impact of transition and climate and physical climate-related risks on their lending and other financial intermediary business activities, but not thinking just in the short term. We're thinking also in the medium and long term. These metrics should relate to credit exposure, equity, debt holdings, or even trading positions. And as we have been, as we discussed in the previous slides, we are seeing mandates for TCFD in many different jurisdictions. And some that I'm going to highlight here in this slides are the US with the SEC requirements for disclosure. In the EU, we are seeing the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and they both go a bit beyond the TCFD. They look at other areas, but when we think about the reporting structure and frameworks, we think about the core pillars and the areas of the TCFD being quite aligned with the general requirements for disclosure in many jurisdictions. And another key area that we are gonna talk a little bit more in a minute is the ISSB standards. I'm not gonna get too much into right now. We're gonna have a slide just for that. But these are being finalized and it's gonna be probably coming to effect in 2024. So it's something to look for and also relates a lot to the work that has been done with the TCFD. We are also seeing in this process many central banks starting to go through stress testing exercises. So we saw Bank of England doing that, the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, Bank of Canada, and this could increasingly start influencing other supervisors or regulatory action in this space. So what is ISSB? I'm not sure if everyone knows, but when we're talking about the regulatory movement, the aspect of international standardization has received a big push in this last years, mostly because of the work from the IFRS Foundation. Here in the slide, we bring the moment that shows the support the international leaders bring to this this initiative. And it was in 2021 that the IFRS Foundation announced the creation of its new International Sustainability Standards Board. That's basically ISSB. Its main task is to develop a comprehensive global baseline of high-quality sustainability disclosure standards with the objective of meeting investors' information needs in general, because this is a key point. Why do we have disclosure and why do we have frameworks and standards? So we can have information from many jurisdictions that relate to each other, that you can understand and that are interoperable. So this is a key information. We need to have standards and frameworks that guide companies and banks to knowing exactly what's being reported, understanding the same key points, and having some general guidelines that all can utilize in their reporting procedures. The ISSB was announced at COP26 in Glasgow and has gained a lot of traction in these last few years. The structure of the ISSB disclosure requirements is very much aligned with the TCFD. It built a lot from what the TCFD had already done. So we are going to discuss a little bit more how these two topics they relate, how the ISSB, these new standards that are being created, relates to the recommendations and the pillars that came from TCFD. It's a mess here. Okay. So now in this slide, you can see a little bit more how the four focus areas that Tiffany already brought in her speech connect to the work that the ISSB has been developed. And this is what I would like to highlight in this presentation. In the first instance, I would just like to remind everyone that ISSB standards stipulate general requirements as well as requirements related to specific themes and industries. So we have these two different requirements. The first theme that we see is climate theme coming from the ISSB, but we are going to see other things related to sustainability as well. So when we think about the ISSB and what has been released so far and how it connects to the TCFD, it has remained consistent with the four core pillars that Tiffany has mentioned. So we are thinking about governance, strategy. These are the two focus points that we are going to discuss in this webinar today. Risk management and metrics and targets. So the pillars remain the same. There are a little differences from the TCFD and ISSB climate standards, mostly related to granularity or additional different language use. But when we think about this two, they're very much related. And this is extremely important when you're talking about disclosure. So it's not something completely new that's being developed. The TCFD is the building block, let's put it like this, for other disclosure frameworks or standards that have showed after 2017. And now, besides the ISSB, we should look at the reporting scenario as a constantly evolving space. And one of the most recent topics that have been discussed and has been debated in this scenario is how nature, how biodiversity relate to climate. And this is a key question that has been discussed and is in a focus point today in the debate on disclosure. So we recently saw the launch of the final version of the TNFD guidelines. What is TNFD? TNFD stands for Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. Basically, the mission of TNFD is to develop and deliver a risk management and disclosure framework for organizations to report and act on evolving nature-related risks. So what's the aim of all that? Basically supporting a shift of global financial flows away from what we consider nature-negative outcomes and towards a more nature-positive outcomes. And how we connect TNFD with the TCFD. Basically, TNFD is a framework also anchored in the four pillars that were established by the TCFD. So we have the same four pillars, and TNFD has incorporated the 11 recommendations that were established by the TCFD. So we see they interconnect, and TNFD has used a lot of the TCFD work to build its recommendations and its work. So what this movement is doing, basically they are providing market participants with a high level alignment of both the structure, language, approach, always thinking about the TCFD and building on that. So companies, banks, the financial institutions in general can understand and can adapt and incorporate in an easier way. And this process should encourage market participants to think about a more integrated climate nature disclosures, not thinking just about climate, but now with the nature aspect of it. And in the same way as TCFD, the TNFD is a framework. It's not a standard. So it gives general guidelines of how to do the disclosure process. This final draft is being worked on. So we are going to have two great news this year. So we are going to have probably the final version of the TNFD. And in 2024, we're probably going to have ISSB come into effect. And this last slide, we're gonna discuss a little bit just how all these reporting frameworks fit together. I'm not going to get too much into it because of time, but we're probably going to have some more news on the ISSB So look forward to that in the coming weeks. So I think we can go to the question, and it should appear to you. The ISSB standards are only relevant for organizations using IFRS. And you should. Okay, now it's going. Em português, as normas do ISSB são relevantes apenas para organizações que usam o IFRS. Vamos ver. Todo mundo está conseguindo ver? Se algum problema, vocês avisam no chat, por favor. Obrigada. Okay, so most of you got it right. ISSB is relevant for everybody, like not just for a specific framework or standard. ISSB standards, they are going to relate and they are going to interconnect with both frameworks or standards that are already in place. So we're talking about incorporating some other standards or frameworks that are no longer going to exist, but many others are either collaborating with ISSB, so we are talking about GRI and even CDP, and others are the foundation of ISSB, and ISSB is going to cover similar disclosures while taking a step further, going a little bit further. So we're talking about TCFD and how incorporates a lot of the work that has already been done and is going to be utilized. And now it's going to give another tool for companies and from different sectors to use and to improve their disclosure. And I think my time's up. Tiffany, back to you.
Thanks, Aissa. And we'll give everybody a short break. So if you please come back in 5 minutes, we'll get started again. Thanks, everyone.
A warm welcome to everyone, and I'm really excited to kick off the second half of today's training session, which will really be about the first two pillars of the TCFD framework. So I guess a little bit about myself here first. My name is Hugh-Yan Cheng, you can call me Yan, and I'm from the UNEP FI Climate Risk and TCFD program. I mainly work alongside my team with banks and climate risk tool vendors, and we are really hoping to prepare banks and more financial institutions for TCFD related or climate related disclosures. And back on, now if you look at the screen, you can see the core elements of the TCFD recommendations, which can be divided into four main pillars: governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets. And today we will cover the first two, which is governance and strategy. And just before I delve into the governance pillar, I just want to add a quick thing, because there has been a lot of questions about the ISSB, which stands for the International Sustainability Board Standards, which are coming in terms of how they relate to the TCFD framework. For the ISSB, which is one that is handled by the IFRS Foundation and the TCFD recommendations, it actually really comes down to the national governments, whether they decide if they want to use the standards or not, and whether these standards will be implemented on a regional or national level. And of course, different countries and regions will follow different procedures for proposing and then approving these standards. And at the moment, there is a lot of discussion among the main standard setters in this area in terms of harmonizing and doing more conversions, and also benchmarking the different standards and how you can also move from one standard to the other. In the EU context, an example would be the ESRS, which stands for the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, which is under the CSRD, Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. So you can see that this is really an ongoing topic and journey for everyone. And with that, I will move to today's topic about governance, the governance pillar of the TCFD framework. And the governance pillar really concerns the reporting organization's approach to govern around climate-related risks and opportunities, both at the board and management levels. And this is a little bit of divergence from the traditional corporate governance, which usually would just look at the board level. So for the TCFD, governance implies really looking into the efficiency and integrity of the reporting company itself in order to help identify information needed by investors, lenders, and insurance underwriters to appropriately assess and price climate-related risks and opportunities. The reason why investors would want to know about governance is that they could get the context in terms of how the reporting company or bank governs and really embeds climate-related financial risks and opportunity into its board or top management agenda and operations. And if we move on to the next slide, we can see a checklist of both types of disclosures, which is under the governance pillar of the TCFD framework. The first disclosure requirement is to describe the role of board in overseeing climate-related issues. So here you really want to consider this as a disclosure and discussion on processes and frequencies by which the board considers climate change. For example, are there particular board committees focusing on related topics, like whether there is a risk and audit committee or a sustainability or ESG committee that look into climate-related risk and opportunities? And if so, what are the roles of these committees? Are climate-related risk and opportunities recurring items on the board agenda, or what are the reporting lines or chains of command looking like? And for the overall board, you would really want to disclose information on whether the board considers climate-related issues. For example, are these topics when reviewing strategy, or is it relevant when it comes to risk management policies or expenditure? In essence, how are climate risks and opportunities factored into these decision-making processes? And how does the board monitor and oversee the progress against the targets that they have set against how they would want to address different types of climate-related issues? And if so, how is the board decision or decision-making process evaluated? And is climate really a part of the evaluation and even the remuneration process for the board or directors? And then we can look at part B, which is the second aspect of the disclosure on the governance level, which is really about the role of the management in assessing and managing climate-related issues. So the TCFD refers to management quite broadly as any level of senior governance below the board level. And it's important to keep in mind this broad level of definition when we are looking into the disclosure recommendations. And in this part, you really want to consider a discussion of what specific individual roles and committees and functions have oversight of what kind of climate change related issues at a management level, and what are their responsibilities. How do they fit within the organizational structure? Or how are they kept informed of climate related issues? How do these different levels of management monitor such climate related issues, and how the performance in terms of progress towards set climate targets are achieved? And often we find when we look at how companies disclose, we could find that it could be a recurring issue that the communication between the board and the management may not be as good as we would want them to be in terms of addressing how they address the agenda items in terms of how they govern climate-related risks and opportunities. And please note that these are not only there are also supplemental guidance or guidelines that are available for recommended disclosures, which are particularly useful for banks. And so you could really look into that to learn more about the core recommended disclosure in this regard. And if we move on to the next slide, we can see from the TCFD 2022 status report that we did an analysis on the current state of disclosure practices, as well as the program's progress, which has been made over the past 5 years. So in this latest report, we have evaluated more than 3,800 organizations that have become supporters of the TCFD recommendations, which shows a steady growth. And these supporters include over 1,500 financial institutions that are responsible for assets of over 217 trillion US dollars. And on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see the graphics concerning the percentage of companies that are disclosing in information in relation to governance. We can see that despite being one of the most regulated issues, being governance and the key backbone of a company, governance remains one of the least reported or disclosed pillars. Moving on to the next.
Jan, we can't hear you anymore. I think your microphone became unplugged. Jan? Sorry, everyone. We'll get Jan back. Yes, come back, Jan. I've just texted her, so hopefully we get her back. I think her microphone came completely out. Okay, Vanina, maybe while you keep trying to get Jan to come back, I wonder if she'll just move to the next slide or not before I start discussing this. Okay, well, since we're on this slide, Oh, we're moving to the next slide. So I'll let everybody know about this slide. It's a continuation, and it has the organizational chart. So Schroders, which was the company that we looked in the previous slide, which you can of course look at in the handout. It provides here further information on each of the forums and working groups that the company has. And as per TCFD's recommendation, the organization shares details on the chairperson, membership, and frequency of committee meetings, which is really important. Now, the second one here is a good example of how we can see kind of the visualization of this come through. So you can see here that Nedbank, which is a South African bank, also it's an IFC climate client, so they know a lot about this particular bank. IFC has invested over 200 million to help it expand in green finance operations. And specifically here, it's worth noting that they have this specific climate team. You can see the climate task force there. And it shows the delegation of responsibilities to the board committees and management function outlined in the organogram here and in the summary of the information, which helps report readers to understand how climate-related matters are reported to the board. While the description, of course, provides details of how the board oversees the climate-related risks and opportunities, and then who the climate task team reports in the team in terms of climate risk committees, then group executive committees, and then going to the group resilience committee as well. Oh, we might have Jan back.
Oh, hello.
Jan, sorry. So you cut out for a little while, so I just took over, but I'll pass back to you now. I think we kind of got through this slide.
Oh, yeah, really sorry about that. And
No
I
problem.
was just explaining in terms of how reporting organizations can do governance related disclosure. And this is an example from Nedbank, which is a South African bank. And as you can see on the slide here, they have a climate team and a climate risk committee. And then it really shows the delegation of responsibilities to the board committees and management function, as well as the chain of command and information. So when we present information like this, it really helps report readers understand how climate related issues are reported from different levels of within a company's management level to the board. And on the other hand, you can also see detailed descriptions in terms of how the board actually oversees climate-related risks and opportunities. Overall, it helps to paint a more holistic picture of how climate-related information could be managed within the leadership of the company, which is key to the governance pillar of the TCFD framework. And if we move on to the next slide, we delve into the third example, which is from a TCFD report from Standard Bank, which is actually the largest bank by assets and which is based in South Africa. Here we can see the specific roles and responsibilities the different risk committees have. One important area here is the upscaling and leadership and the board. And this is really an important area for making sure that the board has the skills and expertise necessary to continue support the governance pillar related disclosure. And you can also see that information regarding continuous training and education is also provided here to ensure, as I've mentioned earlier, that the board really has the skills and governance and expertise in order to fulfill the overseeing of climate-related risk and opportunities that have been embedded into or are being embedded into the company strategy. Then on to the next slide, this one. Now we have understood how the governance pillar look like. We would like to talk a little bit about the regional program structure within UNEP FI. So to really help prepare financial institutions for climate risk assessment and for the TCFD disclosure, especially at a regional level for capacity building, we provide a regional program structured as shown on the screen. For regional program, through these regional programs, we allow members to focus on country and regional context specific to their needs. We offer modules in varying levels of depth depending on the objective or the audience and the budget. For instance, you can see on the light version, we allow individuals to join up to 4 webinars on specific climate topics. And we also offer a more detailed engagement that covers multiple topic areas and help build capacity practically. Additionally, we also offer an in-depth program that provides firms with concrete actions in order to enhance their climate readiness. For example, we worked with GIZ in Vietnam on a 2-year project in which we developed the TCFD guidance and best practices for participating banks in this region. And that's an excellent example of how our work that highlights the concrete actions we take in order to enhance climate readiness of financial institutions in different regions. On to the next slide. Here you can see a case study of a light regional program that is focused on climate workshops for Eastern Europe with the support of FIM. The program involved banks and financial institutions from Eastern Europe and neighboring countries, with 2 sessions covering specific regional climate risks and methodologies for assessing risks within their portfolios. The program's objectives were to familiarize participants with climate risks and also to provide them with access to various resources to explore within their teams. The program's outputs included presentation and also guidelines to open source data resources that they could leverage for climate related risk assessment, also opportunity assessment, which are providing valuable information and tools that support the overall climate risk assessment practice of financial institutions. Then on to the next slide, you can see a case study of a medium regional program that focuses on exploring the fundamentals of climate risk in the MENA region with support from the UNDP. This program involved financial institutions and financial supervisors within the region, with 2 sets of our 4 sessions, which were covering specific regional climate risks, current regulatory developments, risk assessment techniques, and also resources for climate data. And this program's objectives were to enable financial institutions and financial supervisors to understand global best practices on climate risks and in order to accelerate their own progress on risk management in terms of the climate risk side. The program's outputs include presentation, also guidance to open source data, which provides valuable information that any financial institution could leverage in order to assist their process for risk and opportunity assessment. And then here we can see a deep regional program case study, which we did together with GIZ support with the State Bank and of the Vietnamese and also Vietnamese banks in terms of analyzing climate risk and reporting under the TCFD framework. This program in specific involves several major banks and the Central Bank of Vietnam, with an intensive year-long structure consisting of 8 workshops on climate science, risks, regulatory practices, policies, and disclosure guidance. The program here aimed to enable participants to conduct their own climate risk assessment and issue their first TCFD frameworks, while also providing best practice guidance on climate risk reporting. This program's output include also presentations, but on the other hand, also a very comprehensive report on Vietnam's climate risk and best practices for firms in developing TCFD reports. An interesting note here is that this year we are also planning on, based on the output from the exercise with Vietnam, we are planning to include another comprehensive report that are focusing on emerging economies. And it will also include approaches to transition physical risk and also topics related to the just transition, which has become the hot topic, especially following with the ILO's World Work Summit that is just concluded a few days ago. So please stay tuned for this upcoming report. And with that, in we have covered what we did in terms of regional capacity building. And if you look at the slide here, it's actually just one of the pillars within our climate risk and TCFD program at UNEP FI. You can see that our program is structured around 3 main pillars. So content sessions, capacity building, working groups, and also the other 2, regional capacity building and thought leadership, which is outside the 3 core pillars. If we look at Pillar 1, content sessions, we really aim to host content sessions aimed to facilitate peer and expert discussions on timely topics related to climate risk assessment. Such discussions are conducted in larger groups and typically consist of 1 session per topic. For example, we discussed the release of the NGFS scenarios and also the latest takeaways from the COP meeting. And if we look at Pillar 2, capacity building, it really focuses on providing practical guidance for the implementation of climate risk management best practices. And this pillar, it aims to facilitate peer exchange opportunities, which is carried out in both small and larger groups. And it typically involves 2 to 3 sessions per topic. Examples of topics that were covered under this pillar include transition planning and TCFD reporting. And if we look at the 3rd pillar, which concerns working groups, here it's really about creating practical outputs in terms of databases or reports and guidance that facilitate peer exchange on specific topics. It is really about working with smaller groups of banks and even linking them up with climate risk vendors in order to help them navigate how, to understand what is the latest climate risk landscape looking like, what are the solutions on the market that are providing solutions to climate risk assessment, and then the different methodologies and assumptions that different.
I think we lost Jan again. Yeah, mic's off again. Sorry. Okay. Well, I think she was nearly done this slide here. I wonder if Vanina, can you pass on the...
Apologies about the
there we go.
sound
She's
problem.
back.
I hope it works now. So I was talking about the 3rd pillar, which is about working groups. And here we are really dedicated to providing practical outputs, which facilitates peer exchange. And we are delving deeper into climate-related topics, such as how is climate risk assessment held, and what are the latest solutions in the market that are provided by different vendors. We are facilitating the exchange between banks in different regions, and also linking them up with tool providers in terms of better aligning their needs for climate risk assessment with the functionalities that are available in these tools. And it's worthwhile to note that in this regard, we have just very recently in June published a technical supplement to our 2023 climate risk landscape report, which you could download for free on the UNEP FI website. In this report, you can really understand what are the different assumptions and methodologies that different climate risk tool providers are working on that might give rise to differences in terms of results that they have generated, even given the same sort of data input. And by reading this report, and also we have a database that helps you navigate around your selection of the tool that best fit your needs. I think you could find the report, the technical supplement, and the database in our climate risk landscape report really useful. So my colleague Leah has just put up the link that you could use to download the technical supplement and also the database. I hope you would find the resource useful. And on to the next slide. Yeah, so we have talked about our program structure and the working groups and the practical outputs that we have produced. If you're interested in joining our program and becoming a participating member, please contact my colleague Leah and Mahin through the email addresses that are displayed here on the slide, and we will really just get back to you and provide you with the steps that you might need to follow in order to join our program. And here, I think it is about the training program that is run by us at UNEP FI Climate Change Working Group and the UNEP FI Training Department. We offer also an online course in person, as well as in-person workshop on important issues related to climate change. While the course was first held in 2007, we have found really strong demand amongst financial institutions like banks, because they would really want to learn more about climate change and how climate change could transmit into different types of financial risk, and that could end up affecting the financial standing of institutions. And today, with the climate change agenda becoming even more relevant for financial service sector, with the support of CAF, which is the Latin American Development Bank, we also offer an online course on climate change and a task force on climate-related financial disclosure, risks and opportunities for the banking industry. You can check out this course through the link in the slide here. Okay, so we've talked about the governance structure for now, and if you would like to learn more about what this pillar means, or find further guidance in terms of how you can actually do governance related disclosures, here are some really good resources that are already available that is developed by the TCFD. You can also, again, navigate to the link on the slide and to get more information about the recommendations and also technical supplement and guidance that could be relevant for disclosure needs. And I will hand over back to colleagues at the IFC to talk about this slide here.
Actually, I will take that over because our colleagues that normally talk about this aren't here. So just to flag that the IFC's climate governance matrix and tip sheet was recently launched by the IFC Sustainability Solutions Department. And they also offer additional resources on sustainability and climate disclosure through their Beyond the Balance Sheet disclosure and transparency program and toolkit. So yet more tools that you can make use of. We will share more details about the toolkit at the end, but just to note that based on IFC's well-established corporate governance methodology, this framework and toolkit provides practical and progressive climate-related actions from basic practices at level 1 all the way up to leadership level 4 for each of the 6 parameters of the corporate governance methodology, which you can see here are commitment to environmental, social, and governance, structure and functioning of the board of directors, control environment, disclosure and transparency, treatment of minority shareholders, and of course, governance of stakeholder engagement. So we'll share a link to that in the chat, and I'm going to pass back to Jan to take us through the next session. Thanks, Jan.
Yeah, sure. So now we'll move on to the second core element, which is the strategy pillar of the TCFD framework, to discuss climate resilient strategies and, sorry about that. Yeah, to disclose information in terms of the strategy pillar. Strategy disclosures are important for showing a firm's understanding of its climate-related exposures. And as part of its operational resilience strategy is planning and decision-making process that's surrounding resilience planning. And the strategy pillar in the TCFD framework can provide practical insights into the type, the magnitude, as well as the time horizon of climate-related exposures. And this also includes potential impacts of climate change as well as climate opportunities. It's also important to know that strategy disclosures need to address how an institution can integrate these risks and opportunities into their own strategy, business strategy, and financial planning. On to the next slide. Here we can see a checklist of 3 parts of disclosures that fall under the strategy pillar of the TCFD framework. So you can see there are 3 main components when it comes to disclosure under strategy. The first recommended disclosure focuses on identifying climate risks and opportunities. Then the second main component is identifying what is the main impact of these risks and opportunities on institutions' business strategy and its financial planning, and as well as the institution's business as usual. Then finally, the third recommended disclosure focuses on the resilience of the organizational strategy and the use of scenario analysis to identify that. So some good practices for these components include disclosing details of the time horizon that is used. This means, is it concerning short, medium, or long-term time horizon, and also providing a justification for using different time horizons, just because climate risks can materialize differently depending on the time horizon that is used for analysis and as well as disclosure. And obviously the same goes with for the specific region or business unit that you might want to look at in terms of assessing risks and opportunities. Then it's also important to cover the methodologies and processes that are used to identify these climate risks and opportunities that are disclosed. So this includes providing descriptions of the risks and opportunities that are identified, the actual and potential impact on the different lines of businesses, including the financial performance and standing of the company, and also how you judge the materiality of those impacts for further prioritization to address the relevant risks and opportunities. With that, we can go to part C concerning resilience, which is really about the plans your organizations have in terms of managing, mitigating, and adapting to the identified risks, including any transition plans and how scenario pathways could impact the business strategy and financial standing of your organization. In this regard, scenario analysis is a very important aspect of the strategy disclosure. And this is something that we will be going into a bit later in today's session as well. More onto the strategy disclosure progress. Again, here's a quick overview based on the status report from the TCFD 2022 report. You can see that progress has been made by companies in the strategy disclosure. And we can see that companies are more likely to disclose information on their climate risk and opportunities compared with the impact of those risks and opportunities and the resilience of their strategy. And in fact, they are more likely to provide information on their climate-related risks and opportunities identified than any other recommended disclosure. On the other side of the spectrum, however, when it comes to strategy C, which is where we use scenario analysis to test strategy resilience, this is where we find the lowest disclosure overall. On to the next slide. This shows, we're going to show you 2 examples in terms of how disclosure under the strategy pillar could be made. Now, the first example is from Barclays TCFD report for 2021. The report here highlights climate-related risks and opportunities over different time horizons, which are then classified into 3 categories: short-term, which in their definition is 0 to 1 year, medium-term, long-term up to 30 years. In addition, the report also outlines the institution's support and strategies for a diverse range of clients, including emerging companies, major corporations, and governments. And while we will be going through the risk and opportunities that TCFD specifically highlights in part 2 of this webinar, I'll also highlight here that this disclosure uses the same terminology as the TCFD to classify the risk, and then it further identifies then what type of impact it expects to see from each identified risks For example, when addressing physical risk, which is a type of climate risk, the bank highlights here that acute climate physical risk, which is like wildfire or floods, can be extreme weather events, which can impact credit and market risks, as well as posing a risk to business continuity for the bank. And as you can see in those first couple of bullet points here in the table, that you can further explore in details on the slide. Here we move on to the second example for strategy disclosure from RBC. They used scenario analysis in order to identify some of the key physical and transition risk facing that the bank is facing. What you can see here is that scenario analysis is used to show different opportunities that are occurring when it comes to different opportunities related to climate change, and how that can then be used to improve their strategic resilience, as well as to help them explore the points of vulnerabilities they could face in order to improve how they could mitigate these risks or adapt to such risks. So you can see that they have covered physical risks and transition risk here, and they have also identified where their priorities lie when it comes to key or material climate risks. We can see here also that they've looked at physical risk scenarios, as well as using transition risk scenarios for analysis. And they really used information here through scenario analysis to identify their strategies and their priorities. An example here is that if we consider real estate and assets in that space, looking at how various physical risks can damage properties and how that can then impact your future financial planning. This is one important use case for scenario analysis, which is exactly the next part of our presentation today about scenario analysis. So scenario analysis is one of the main tools that are recommended for financial institutions for various purposes, including, for example, climate stress testing, and also judging the level of alignment between their portfolios or assets to the Paris Agreement goals, for example. To make this a bit clearer, let's go deeper into what scenario analysis mean and how you can make use of this tool. So first things first, what is scenario analysis? It is the use of narratives, which is referred to as scenarios, to sketch out the potential future states of the world. It kind of originated in academic research in the 1950s, but then it's soon widely applicable to large companies, now the financial sector as well, in terms of assessment of climate risk now. In the climate risk and opportunity assessment context, scenario analysis often starts with global reference scenarios, which includes the IPCC and NGFS scenarios, which we will talk more a little bit later in today's session. And then we apply these various parameters and assumptions and make analytical choices, such as around the time horizon, whether it's short, medium, or long-term analysis, before outputs can be generated for risk assessment. And here you can see on the slide different use cases for climate risk, for climate scenario analysis, such as it could be used to inform TCFD or climate-related disclosures, as climate scenarios are an important part of not only the strategy pillar, but also the risk management pillar, which is something that we'll talk about in tomorrow's session within the TCFD framework. Scenario analysis is also helping financial institutions with regulatory compliance, particularly surrounding not only climate-related due diligence and reporting, but also, as I've mentioned before, climate stress testing, which more and more central banks are considering, if not already implementing, for their prudential supervision. Then, as reaching net zero becomes increasingly a global consensus, we can also see an uptake of scenario analysis for integrating climate-related risks and opportunities into the asset underwriting processes, but also B, for strategy and target setting for robust transition to net zero. And then finally, scenario analysis can also be used to optimize internal processes, such as internal reporting. Then we can move on to the next slide. Now that we know what scenario analysis means and what it can be used for, but then what are climate scenarios, right? On this slide, you can see that climate scenarios are produced from climate models, which are known as integrated assessment models, or IAMs, which are developed by climate scientists and modelers. The IAMs initially were developed for policymakers to describe the relationship between economic activities, greenhouse gas emissions, and the potential outcomes. In a way, the IAMs look at the interplay between what is happening in the society, like the economic activities, the businesses and finance activities, and the relationship with the natural environment. In terms of how IAMs are constructed, typical inputs, as you can see on the slide, include socioeconomic drivers such as GDP and population growth, technologies, policy instruments and changes, and climate-related targets such as alignment with the Paris Agreement goals, or increasingly now to the net zero targets. Then we look at a great amount of details in terms of energy systems, the different energy mixes. While we also make some simplifying assumptions related to climate systems and land use. And at the end of the day, results from IAMs show the combination and timing of different emission mitigation approaches to reach a specific warming target, and hence create climate scenarios that we can then use for our risk assessment purposes. So it really helps when you are trying to analyze the potential trade-offs between different climate mitigation pathways and what to prioritize. Now, before we get into, we'll have a little activity later today. If we have time, I would just like to talk a little bit about the NGFS scenarios. So the NGFS scenarios are reference scenarios that are produced by the Network for Greening the Financial System, which is a group of central banks that are dedicated to pushing forward a green financial system. And these scenarios are widely used across the financial sectors in different regions. And although this slide does not include the NGFS phase 3 scenarios, which is the most recent scenarios, we can still talk about what some of the key narratives of the NGFS scenarios are based on the level of transition risk and the level of physical risk. So when we look at the NGFS scenarios, it can be widely categorized into 4 groups. As you can see here, disorderly and orderly on the left, and then too little, too late, and then a hothouse scenario on the right. So if we look at an orderly scenario, which is at the top left bottom corner, we can see that we assume that climate policies are introduced promptly in a timely manner. And so at the beginning, they're introduced early enough and then hence gradually implemented and strengthened. And hence we can understand that in this scenario, both the physical and transition risk would be low. And then if we look at this orderly scenario, which is just above the orderly scenario on this graphic here, it is where we assume that climate-related policies are delayed or introduced abruptly. This could result in sudden or sharp emissions reduction, which could lead to higher transition risks. And then in the hothouse world scenario, which is on the bottom right corner, it is really a scenario where we assume current policies are preserved and the climate and the warming targets, that is the 1.5 or 2 degrees Paris Agreement goals, are not met. And hence, in this scenario, emissions would continue to grow until 2080, leading to more than 3 degrees of warming and significant physical risk. As you can see, that physical risk in this scenario are very high. And there is also a too little, too late scenario, which is just above hothouse scenario. Here we can see that it would be a very late transition, which then fails to limit physical risks, and hence the physical risk and transition risk in this scenario are both high. The NGFS scenarios it's important to note that this is just, the NGFS scenario is just one type of what we call reference scenarios that are commonly used for analysis. There are also other reference scenarios, such as those by the IEA, which is the International Energy Agency, and the IPCC's SSP, which is the shared socioeconomic pathways, and RCP, representative concentration pathways. Financial institutions can decide on which scenarios to use depending on the needs, depending on their own needs. A couple of factors to consider here includes the warming target that you want to align your portfolios or assets with, like whether it is net zero by 2050, whether it is 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees of warming. And secondly, it is also worthwhile to consider the sectoral and regional differences in order to ensure the right level of data granularity to enable adequate analysis. And onto the next slide here, just very quickly, again, there are very useful resources that you can navigate to the link here on the slide on more details regarding guidance and even sectoral guidance on how to do the strategy disclosure. Okay, so a quick question here is, does your bank conduct scenario analysis? And if yet, what type of climate risk? And if no, do you plan to do that? But please understand that, of course, there is no correct answer. This is just a simple exercise that helps us to understand how banks in Brazil are using scenario analysis. So look forward to your answer. There we have a quick exercise here, which we could, for the sake of time, you can look at the slide here for the 4 questions that you can consider when you have time after the session today, and you can make use of the earlier slides like this one, and this one here in order for you to help work out what type of scenarios best suit your needs and how you can best leverage scenario analysis as a tool for climate risk assessment. So with that, I'll hand over back to colleagues at SSE for today's session.
Okay, thank you, Jan. And we still have that poll up. I'm going to close it soon. But just to discuss briefly that the highest amount of you, the 37%, here I'll close the poll so you can all see the results. So 37% of you do not currently do a scenario analysis, but you plan to. So I hope that these tools can be a useful guide for you to move forward. We've also shared some links to some tools in the Q&A as well for those of you who had questions. And of course, you have the link that we shared earlier and in the slides to the UNEP-FI's work, where they've collected a whole series of tools that you can use. So those can be very useful for you. Interesting to note that of those who are conducting a scenario analysis, you're using both scenarios for physical risk as well as transition risks, the majority of you. So bravo for that. And someone actually in the Q&A was asking, how do you justify the conclusion of a climate scenario analysis, which Leah thinks is answering, when it may be something not happening yet? So I think this is a great question. Leah is going to provide more feedback in the Q&A there. But just to kind of speak to what she's going to talk about there is that this is exactly what the scenario analysis is for. So find out more there in the Q&A. And great, I'm going to stop sharing this and we're going to move on to some other great tools that you can use as you continue on your journey. Oh, someone did ask, can small companies use these tools? Yes, for sure. Small companies can use them. And actually, when we talk about the TCFD for smaller companies, it's actually not recommended that they just pick and choose certain areas, but rather just start lightly on all of the 11 recommended disclosures. So really understanding how it applies to your organization. Now, smaller companies will have less of an impact and it will be more integrated. So what are the tools you can use moving forward? First and foremost, of course, the recommendations themselves. It's a large document, but it has a lot of explanatory detail in there about all the risks, all the opportunities, how they can be integrated into your strategy, and it gives some examples of how to move forward as well. As you use that as a starting point, you can also use the SSE's model guidance on climate disclosures and the TCFD Knowledge Hub, where you can find all of these resources. And as mentioned, the IFC Beyond the Balance Sheet, which really helps on that governance component that we were talking about and how that governance can then trickle into your disclosure. I'm going to skip through these last few here because I see we're a bit short on time, but they're all in your handout and great resources as you're moving forward, both for governance and for strategy. And of course, as you've heard a lot from Unipify, don't forget their website and their tools that are specifically tailored for the banking sector. These documents are all from central banks or private banks, so you can get a bit more guidance specifically from your sector. And of course, the 2023 Climate Risk Landscape Report, which we've shared with you. That's just a bit more details on it. Now, with that, I did want to give a few moments to Carlos. So just right before I pass to you, Carlos, just to let everybody know, we are providing certificates of participation. We've had a few people ask about that. So if you do send us if you fill out the survey that we're going to send in the chat box. So Vanina's now sending, or Jacqueline, one of them, yeah, great, are sending a little form. It's a Google form. If you fill that out, it gives you a moment to reflect on what you learned today. And once you fill that in, we will send you a certificate within 7 working days. And with that, I'd like to pass over to Carlos Serrano for closing out today's session. Over to you, Carlos.
Thank you very much, Tiffany. And I have posted my message in Portuguese in the chat. Sorry, I don't speak Portuguese, but in the name, on behalf of IFC team and my team, I want to appreciate and thank the over 200 participants that we had today in this cohort from Brazil and from other countries outside the region. And I also, of course, want to appreciate and thank very much to our allies, the United Nations Sustainable Stock Exchange Initiative, United Nations Environmental Program, Finance Initiative, and Climate Disclosure Project. And especially to our speakers today, starting by you, Tiffany, that as always have done a fantastic job. Thank you for driving us through this webinar. And I ask you all participants, please participate tomorrow, because if today was interesting, tomorrow is even more interesting. And instead of having one certificate, you will have 2, because we have 2 different contests. So we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. And I hope that this has been useful to all of you. And I wish you a good evening. Bye. Obrigado.
Thanks, Carlos. And just a reminder to everyone, if you haven't registered for tomorrow's session, please do so. The link's been shared in the webinar chat. Also, if you can't seem to access it, you can also find that link on our website, on the sseinitiative.org website under Academy Events. You'll see TCFD for Banks, and you can register that way as well. And if you can't access the Google form, which some of you are having trouble, you will get emailed it by Zoom. So not to worry, you will get that link in your inbox soon. Okay, thanks everyone. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thanks, Carlos. Thanks, team.